Apologies that I'm speaking in English. My Arabic should be better, but it isn't. And also apologies that this seems to be a male-only panel. Platform normally has a policy that we don't do panels. I'll give a quick explanation of some of the report's findings. I'll try not to repeat what you've already heard. I'll look at how, I'll try and focus more on how we calculated the figures, and then I'll also put them in some current context of what's going on at the moment in Egypt. So the contracts signed during the Mubarak years, particularly since 2000, covered, there's lots of different types of oil and gas contracts, but the ones that we look at in the report cover the export of billions of cubic meters of gas, natural gas, to Spain via liquefied natural gas. This is like you liquefy, you put it on a ship and it goes over the sea, and also via pipeline to Jordan and to Israeli-occupied Palestine. The gas was sold at far below a fair price. That's been in the media a lot, you know that. And the impact of that was that Egypt lost out on essential revenues. Our calculations showed that the total loss to Egypt was over $10 billion worth of revenues in the 6 years running up to the start of the Egyptian revolution. If you look on the report, in the report, you can see the figures broken down. I didn't do a PowerPoint. If you want to look, on page 13 is a graph that shows gas exports to Jordan. And we calculated the total loss as being $3.8 billion, almost $4 billion. On page 18, there's the gas exports to Spain. And as higher volumes of gas were exported to Spain and the price was even lower, the total loss was over $6 billion. We don't have a graph here for their exports to Israeli-occupied Palestine, but it's similar, although smaller because the volume was less. What that did was basically, in effect, Egypt was subsidizing Spanish, Jordanian and Israeli economies, industries, private companies, as well as transferring significant wealth that should belong to the Egyptian people to private interests, elite interests, particularly also including the mediators, the agents that are also discussed. The sums we're talking about here are huge. $10 billion is more than twice Egypt's annual health budget. That's a lot of money in 6 years. How did we calculate the figures that are in here? The contracts were secret, we've already heard about that. So the pricing for the sales, the prices weren't out there. We spent a lot of time digging around, and actually there were many iterations of the report where we kept out finding more and more details. And the Egyptian Ministry of Petroleum wouldn't share the details either, the people who should didn't. Eventually, through the court papers, we accessed specific prices for different periods, which allowed us to break down how much we think each volume of gas was sold at a particular time. And that's how we assess the losses. Now, it's not a precise science. The figures here are estimates. They're estimates in terms of how much Egypt received, but they're even more estimates in terms of what a fair price would be. As we've heard, there is no global gas price. Gas is different than oil. It's not as fungible, it's not as easy to just send somewhere else. You can't just look in the newspaper and see, okay, the price for gas today is this. However, you can compare it with specific export prices in other countries. So the figures on page 18, where we look at the exports to Spain, what we're doing there is we compare, in the top graph, we compare the revenues that Egypt received is the lower line, and the larger chunk is how much Egypt would have received if that gas had been sold to East Asia. Now that gas was sold on a ship, on LNG, so that in theory that ship could have gone to East Asia instead of to Spain. The graph on page 13, we compare the received revenues both to the alternative LNG price to Japan, but we also compare it to a pipeline price to Europe, to just try and show different possibilities. The losses could have been greater, could have been more than 10 billion. They could be a bit less. It could be 8 billion, could be 7 billion. What's clear is that underpricing caused losses of many, many billions. That's a lot of money. That's a big deal. What's also clear is that this shows us that there's structural problems in how these contracts come about. And we've heard a bit already about how you end up with such destructive terms, including explicit corruption, just weak negotiation practices. Also the fact that Egypt, in some cases, was bargaining from a weak position, heavy pressure externally, and crucially also a lack of debate and accountability. The fact that you don't know what the terms actually were, and you can't then hold a person to account and challenge them for it. And that structural problem is not just about gas exports. In the report, that's what we focus on, these three contracts. Those structural problems also apply to the oil and gas sector as a whole. Egypt has many contracts. For example, it's got its contracts with BP. BP has claims to produce 30 to 40%, to have extracted 30 to 40% of Egypt's total oil in history. And BP is currently planning to invest between $11 and $15 billion in the next years. One particular contract that BP signed for the North Alexandria block in the Mediterranean was signed in the early 2000s and then renegotiated in 2008-2009 on terms which are significantly worse for Egypt. Now, we haven't assessed that in here, but that's another one that has also been publicly criticised, that we'd like to assess in the future, hopefully. And that shows that this is across the board. I've analysed contracts in lots of different countries, contracts from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Iraq, Russia, Uganda, Congo. I've seen a lot of bad contracts, but Egypt is definitely doing, in terms of these ones, it's pretty bad. it's worse. It's a much more obvious rip-off than what I saw in Uganda now. In Uganda, there was no history of oil extraction when those contracts were signed that I looked at there. Egypt has a long history of oil extraction. Egypt has its own state oil companies, Uganda did not. Egypt is also closer to being able to find other markets to export it to. Egypt should not be getting worse deals. It's important to realize we're not just talking about the past. The report might seem dated. In fact, some people in the EIPR were like, why are we putting out a report that's talking about figures from more than 3 years ago? It's important to recognize $10 billion was lost before the revolution started. But these problems continue today. The structural problems haven't changed. Oil and gas contracts remain secret and confidential. That BP report that I mentioned, you can't just go and find it. Public oversight and accountability still doesn't exist. There's no large debate around it. A lot of these issues around stabilization clauses, international arbitration remain the same. And we're still seeing very long-term contracts signed, 20 years, 30 years, that fix these terms. And new deals are being signed all the time, of course they are. Recent contracts have recent oil and gas extraction contracts have been signed for the Gulf of Suez, for Nile Delta, Mediterranean. In December there was one with Dragon Oil for the Said for Egypt. What we're also seeing, not only are new contracts being signed, but we're seeing a change in the terms of these contracts. Now, oil companies have been demanding a shift away from joint ventures. At the moment, most oil extraction projects in Egypt, they're run by a joint venture. It's 50% state oil company and then private oil companies. Sharing it, basically. And there's a lot more, if anyone wants to ask, there's a lot more complexity to then how the revenues end up. It's not 50-50. But a lot of private oil companies don't want this model anymore. BP has been leading the charge in shifting away from that, and they did that successfully with the North Alexandria contract that I described earlier. I was at an oil and gas conference last year and the year before here in Egypt, in Atamea Heights, where the companies were lobbying very hard to shift away from joint ventures and to shift the terms. And it seems like they're increasingly getting what they're demanding. Particularly at the moment, we all know Egypt's in a very precarious position. There's a lot of short-term needs. There's massive blackouts already. Revenue shortages, so there's a lot of pressure on Egypt to sign contracts right now. if you're signing a 20 contract right now on bad terms, you're still going to be stuck with it in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. And the companies are taking advantage of that. And we're seeing that specifically in terms of gas pricing. Okay, cool. As well as gas extraction, there's also now talk about gas import contracts. Actually, this was about the export. There's no gas left to export, so now we don't want to import. And lo and behold, there's talk about importing it from Israeli occupied Palestine, but at a significantly higher price than it was sold to them in the first place. But do we think that contract negotiation is going to be more public and more accountable than the last one? I mean, it should be, given the revolution, but it's unlikely at the moment. So yeah, we could see massive rip-off in those. And at the same time, we've also got the new draft investment law, which is setting out to prevent third-party challenges of contracts. Now, part of the reason that we know about corruption in cases and we know about problematic contracts is precisely because of third-party challenges. So it's not that things aren't getting better, it's that things risk getting worse, and that the level of accountability, the level that exists, is being taken away. And yeah, reducing what potential for oversight there is. And obviously there's already a lot of international arbitration, questions like that, in contracts which undermine sovereignty, and the new law will reduce public oversight, public sovereignty over the oil and gas sector. Just briefly, the impacts from dodgy contracts, bad contracts, they're not just about revenue. Revenue is a very big deal. A bad contract can also mean significant impacts for the local community. There can be, I've seen contracts in other countries where there's bad human rights standards, there's local pollution, the company can get away with it. But there's also indirect impacts. So for example, there's been an announcement that the cement industry is planning to start importing coal. Pushing for this for a while, and start powering cement using coal rather than gas, which will lead to significantly greater health impacts on the people of Egypt. Now again, this is partly because of exporting gas for below the price to abroad. That's why we've ended up in these situations. So this is about revenue, and it's also about people dying. It's about health. To conclude, I guess as I said, the report focuses on a few particular disturbing case studies. But it's basically using those to paint a picture of the general mismanagement of Egypt's natural resources. It's the Egyptian people who are paying the price for elite corruption, for mismanagement, with blackouts all the time, we're lucky right now, and a collapsing economy. The changes that we're seeing aren't promising. There's a significant chance that in 5 years' time, we could be having another panel here, I could hold up a similar report, but with a slightly different cover, that could say oil contracts signed under Sisi or whoever have lost Egypt $5, $10, $15 billion. The oil and gas sector remains unaccountable, remains a black box. It's supposed to serve the people. Constitution claims that natural resources are of the state belong to the people, but in reality it's secretive, obtuse. Even when there's people in the sector, and I've met people working in the sector who want to improve the lives of the people of Egypt. It's not that everybody working like at all. Of course not. I met people in the ministries. But when I've spoken to the people in the ministries, their take has been very paternal and very top-down. They will do the right thing for the people of Egypt. Not democratic, not accountability, not accountable. And ultimately it's the Egyptian people who are the owners of Egypt's natural resources, not the politicians, not the officials, whether they're corrupt or honest. And it's Egyptian people who should know what's happening with their resources. And there are lots of, like, this has all been about all the negative stuff and how it's all problematic. There's actually lots of possible solutions. It's not that hard to envision how to do it right. Whether it's actually just things that also increasing renewable energy, but also democratic accountability. We're seeing lots of other countries, Bolivia is a good example, but there's lots of countries where you can see bits and pieces on ensuring that people have more control, more say, more accountable. It's there, it's ready. We just need to shift power to make it happen.
شكرا لميكا. ميكا بينبهنا ان 3 عقود في خساره 10 مليار قبل الثوره، بما يجاوز الكثير من الميزانيات المخصصه للخدمات الاساسيه او حتى حل بعض القضايا.